Hi. So today begins a shift in our discussion from talking about mostly aquatic animals to talking about mainly terrestrial. This shift doesn't seem necessarily like that big of a transition, but it means a very important set of adaptations are needed. So let's dive in. So as we progress into talking about terrestrial animals, of course our trajectory is that we're going to talk about amphibians, reptiles, including birds, and mammals. Before we can do that, though, we need to talk about some of the evolutionary milestones that took place in order for us to have land animals. Recall, and with the fish diversity, we have a gradation from cranialia, who are the first ones to have craniums, to sharks that got us jaws, osteichthyes, like the ray-finned fish here that got us bones, or at least that have ancestors that gave us those bones. Modern tetrapods, or four-legged animals, are descendant from the lungfish, which is a type of lobe fish. Lobed-finned fish have much thicker bones, and as the name implies, the lungfish has a swim bladder that's adapted to use air not only for buoyancy but also for respiration. As we talk about the adaptation to land, the transition to land, we have to keep in mind that this isn't something that happens very often. In order to have a major evolutionary shift like the movement to land, we need to have the existing animals not compete for it. So we saw this when we had mammals and dinosaurs walking the earth at the same time. The mammals were all very, very small. It wasn't until the dinosaurs were out of the picture that mammals really took over. Same thing would happen with the transition to land. We wouldn't get another major movement to land unless the current land animals would somehow be out of the picture. It's important to note that all non-fish vertebrates are basically considered tetrapods because they are ancestors of a four-legged animal. Tetra meaning four, pod meaning foot. There'll be lots of intermediate species that we discuss in class and come up in a video that we watch, but I would like you to, I don't need you to know any of them except for the titalic, because we'll talk quite a bit about that in class. So let's look at some of the adaptations that land animals have evolved. So I mentioned already that having a swim bladder being adapted to hold air for respiration is a pretty important adaptation for life on land. It is, of course, because we don't get air out of water, we get oxygen from air, which is significantly different. So the swim bladder needed to evolve vascularization. In other words, needed to be able to get blood vessels into that pocket of air. Part of that comes from developing a double loop circulation, which is a more efficient delivery of direct oxygenated blood to the lungs. So our double loop circulation means heart pumps to the lungs, back to the heart, and then out to the body. It's more efficient and it's necessary for life on land. Additionally, if you're going to live on land, then you've got to deal with the absence of buoyancy. So in the water, you've probably all experienced the sensation of floating. That's because buoyancy helps counteract gravity. On land, we don't have that, so we need to have stronger bones to deal with the absence of that. As we talk about how tetrapod evolution and why tetrapod evolution occurred, it's likely because life in fresh water is unstable. So a lot of freshwater habitats are temporary. A lot of our lakes, for example, were created by the glaciers, and they're slowly going away. The water's evaporating unless we're getting new water fed from somewhere. And so these unstable habitat often led to the need to go to a new place to find the necessary conditions to survive. We still see the ability of an aquatic animal to get up and move in a variety of animals. Mud skippers, which are amphibians, lungfish, which we mentioned are fish, and a number of others are able to move between freshwater aquatic environments. But this ability to get up and move from one body of water to another also gave rise to organisms who didn't end up at that second body of water. Instead, they became intermediate species that eventually gave rise to tetrapods. If we look at this cladogram again and we start to look at some of the characteristics that we see here, we see slowly the development of a five-fingered limb. We also see a number of these intermediate species. In addition to the development of the five-fingered limb, five-digit limb, we also see a number of other developments as we start from a decidedly fish body shape to a much more amphibian tetrapod body shape. Among those include the stronger limbs, like I mentioned. They also include having a differently shaped cranium to facilitate being able to see and breathe out of water, along with a great number of others. Let's take a moment before we dive deeper and pause for a review. Throughout the study of the diversity of life, we see that as a group of organisms move from aquatic environments to terrestrial environments, they encounter a familiar series of challenges. We see it in plants, we see it in fungi, we see it in arthropods, and now we see it in tetrapods. Some of those challenges we've already mentioned. So we talked about the need for getting oxygen in a different way because air is drier. And there are some additional challenges that we haven't yet talked about. So for one, you might remember from biology that water changes temperature very, very slowly. And so in land, there's a greater fluctuation of temperature. So they need to be able to deal with that fluctuation. However, that also provides a more diverse variety of habitat. That's how we have rainforests and deserts and prairies and savannas. But those are harsher, unpredictable conditions too. Animals have to be able to deal with freezing, thawing, drying out, flooding. All of those things prevent additional challenges just aren't found on land or on water. Additionally, air is different. Air carries oxygen differently. It also carries sound differently. Sound travels more slowly, so they need to have a different type of hearing mechanism. Further, this one might seem obvious, but on land there's less water. But because of that, evaporation is a significant concern. So air, as you know, is a lot drier than land. Than water. That's another obvious one. But that means that gametes, eggs and sperm, and larvae have to deal with drying out. And so there's a lot of adaptations to deal with that. Let's pause briefly for a review. So this slide is really important. In fact, out of all of the notes that you'll take on tetrapods, amphibians, all the way up to mammals, this is probably the most important. So make sure you take really good notes and star some of this. So there are a lot of adaptations that are common to all of the tetrapods that help us deal with the challenges of land. To deal with the increased effect of gravity, we have stronger limbs. We also have a greater position of our limbs. So if you were to say, look at a salmon, if you've ever seen it, the limbs are out to the side. And so, however, if you look at, say, an alligator, its limbs are much more are placed underneath the weight of the alligator. That allows it to support more weight. It's much easier to support your weight when your support is underneath you. Additionally, the tetrapod body plan allows for a greater range of motion. We have ball and socket joints. Not all of us, but a lot of us do. Ball and socket joints that allow for much faster range of motion, as well as a lot more muscle attachment. We talked about air being drier and more oxygen rich, not being able to rely on diffusion like that. So we have the adaptation of lungs. Mentioned about air changing temperature faster. To deal with that, we either have endothermy. Remember, endothermy is being able to control your temperature through metabolism, or behavior. So a reptile, for example, who takes advantage of ectothermy, is going to spend time sunning himself in order to deal with that additional challenge of temperature fluctuation. In addition to sunning, there's all kinds of stuff. There's vaporization, which basically means increasing the rate of evaporation off your body, taking advantage of convection. So, for example, a lot of animals will find a burrow and allow the little bit of heat that their body is producing to circulate in the burrow, covering themselves in mud, water, changing the surface area. So you've probably experienced the need of curling into a ball when it's cold. All of those are behavioral adaptations in order to deal with changing temperatures. Mentioned about sound traveling more slowly in air, so we have an eardrum. The eardrums have tympanic membranes, which is just a fancy word for eardrum, that allows the vibration that's carried in the air to be transmitted to nerves in our ear. Okay. And this one's really important. So that idea of drying out, especially the reproductive cells in the larva, we have two things, metamorphosis and amniotic eggs. You already know about metamorphosis. We saw it a lot in the invertebrate world. So obviously, it's the amphibians that take advantage of that. We'll talk more about that in a second. The animals that are more independent of land have something called an amniotic egg, which we will talk about significantly more detail when we get to reptiles, birds, and mammals. But for now, an amniotic egg is simply an egg that has additional membranes to protect it and prevent it from drying out. And going along with the idea of drying out, we also have kidneys. The kidneys help control water loss. They produce either urine or uric acid, depending upon what kind of animal we're talking about. and that helps control via osmosis how much water is in our bodies. And as you've already seen with the shark's nictitating membrane that covers it in water is the same thing that a lot of animals have that that protect our eyes from drying up. Humans' ancestors actually have a nictitating membrane. Ours is just greatly reduced. It's what we call a vestigial structure, and it's that little pink part in the corner of our eye. The reason we don't have one is because we have tear ducts that help keep our eyes from drying out. All right, as I said, this slide's really important. Make sure you get it down. Let's take a moment to give you time to do that and to review. Of the land animals, by far the simplest are the amphibians. Amphibians literally comes from words that means double life. So they undergo metamorphosis. I'm sure you learned this around about second grade. So amphibians, as you know, for example, the frog starts out as a tadpole, meaning it lives its larval stage in the water. So that helps deal with the dryness of land. They don't have to deal with it because their larvae can live in the easier to live in water. As larvae, many of them have gills. And then as they metamorphosize as adults, they transition into terrestrial animals that don't rely on water as much. They have moist skin with mucus glands that help prevent them from drying out, since many of them still diffuse across their skin for respiration, although most have developed lungs to deal with the higher oxygen content and dryness of air. Despite their ability to survive on land, adults are still tied to water because they do need to be generally moist to respire, most of them. And, of course, they need to reproduce in the water. Their bodies need extra support for life on land, as I mentioned. So amphibians have a number of adaptations for that. So the sternum is the bone that goes right here in between the limbs. That gives them additional support. They also have strong limb girdles, so like that's the scapula, the shoulder blade, and the hip bone. And their bones they have bones with joints in their limbs to help support them as well. Their senses, they include a tympanic membrane, or like an eardrum. If you recall when you dissected a frog in biology, that would be that big circle behind their eye. Amphibians have a double loop circulation, so that means that their heart pumps in two loops that goes once to the lungs, back to the heart, and then out to the body. That's a more efficient pumping technique. And when we talk about amphibians' place in the ecosystem, their role, one of the importance of amphibians to humans is that they are bioindicators. Because they reproduce in water, they are more sensitive to habitat stress than many of the other land animals. So we tend to see that they have more mutations when there's water pollution. They tend to have death faster in pollution. And so they are an indication of habitat health. Let's pause for notes and review. There are a couple of different orders of amphibians. Anora are the frogs and toads. Typically, toads are more adapted to survive in drier climates. We basically consider them jumpers, and they have no external tail in the adults. Urodeli are the salamanders, the newts, and the mud puppies. They, of course, have the tail. They have the very long body. The two pairs of legs. They have a very lizard-looking like body. Apoda are Sicilians. They look very snake-like. They've lost their limbs, and they typically live in the water or burrow under the ground. Let's stop one more time for notes and review. That's it for amphibians. Next time we'll talk more about how reptiles really did a good job of moving onto land.